I think there's a way for Gen Zers or for millennials to say, unlike the boomers, we're really not interested in ambition and success. We're interested in meaning and purpose, but work can't bear that load either. You have to have a life of meaning and of purpose, and the work has to come underneath that, but it can't replace it.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of The Bulletin. In this episode, Russell Moore and I talk with Skot Welch about shifting generational challenges in the workplace. Then Mona Charen joins us to reflect on the 6 Israeli hostages who died this past weekend and how understanding true conservatism helps us chart a path forward. Finally, I sit down with NASA astronaut Jeff Williams to discuss the 2 American astronauts stuck in space and how out-of-this-world experiences can ground us in what matters most. Welcome to the show. This year, Gen Z, those Americans ages 18 to 27, will outnumber their boomer colleagues in the workforce for the first time. But not everybody is happy about their arrival at the office. Cultural, technological, and even mental health shifts are creating tensions, leading many employers to report that Gen Zers are the most difficult employees with whom to work. A March 2024 Freedom Economy Index survey reported that Gen Z received a labor market report card grade of F in reliability, divisiveness, and toxic workplace culture and workplace lawsuits. Ouch. Here to help us tease out the fact from the fiction is Skot Welch, author and founder of the organizational development firm Global Bridge Builders. Skot, welcome back to the Bulletin.
Thanks. It's great to be here again, Clarissa.
So, Skot, you've worked in workplace development and human resources for decades. What's different about the Generation Z employee? What's different from them and the millennial or the boomer?
So when you have people giving a report card of a generation, you have to consider the framework of the report card itself. Who's around the table creating that report card to give this generation an F? So when we think about boomers, the post-World War II economy, right, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they came into a time where the economy was booming. The trait that they're most identified with as a generation is actually the word loyal. Now, when you have them as they're really essentially exiting the workforce right now, then after that, we had the Xers, Gen X, and now we've got the millennials coming in. The millennials were the first generation where they were born essentially online. And not only just online and digitization of culture and marketplace and connection, this is where nano and pocket technology was born also. They were born into this generation. So the thing is, in this environment, the thing that really I find that millennials want is they want work with meaning, whereas boomers, they wanted money, the corner office recognition, and things like that. And the thing is, there's nothing wrong with either of those. And in fact, you're really not accessing the full potential of innovation unless you have all 4 to 5 generations in the workplace at the same time anyway.
Russell, I wonder, you work with a lot of college students. Do you see that they are longing for these things that Skot is talking about, a sense of meaning as they enter the workplace?
I'm always reluctant to put an entire generation in a category, as Scott said, although you can see some trends that are coming along, and I think those things often change. So when Scott was talking about, for instance, the word that one would think of with the boomers being loyal, it's probably not the word that people were thinking of for boomers in 1968 or 1972 when you had the counterculture and the hippies and so forth, and that changed and altered. I also think that there's a potential blind spot to the way that we can pursue our idols when it comes to work that's generationally. So when Scott talks about kind of the typical sort of boomer category of I want to achieve, I want to succeed, I want to be able to have the corner office, ultimately, that's not going to satisfy. It's not going to do that. And so I was just listening to Lisa Kudrow, an actress who was talking about working with Matthew Perry on 1990s sitcom after he just died. And she said the problem is a lot of people who come in and try to achieve in the entertainment industry think it's going to fix what's broken by succeeding, and that doesn't work. It makes it worse. And I think a lot of people who have tried to achieve and succeed have found that. But the same thing is true with this pursuit of work with meaning. And so I think there's a way for Gen Zers or for millennials to say, unlike the boomers, we're really not interested in ambition and success. We're interested in meaning and purpose, but work can't bear that load either. You have to have a life of meaning and of purpose, and the work has to come underneath that, but it can't replace it. If we think this generation has these idols and they're a problem, and we're answering those idols, we often don't see, well, sometimes we're just replacing one set of golden calves with another.
That's interesting that you say that because 91% of the small business owners who were surveyed in this Freedom Economy Index said that they believe that colleges were creating unrealistic expectations among students about what their job and work life would be like post graduation. Has the idol of careerism been something that we've been feeding our kids for a long time now that we hear the Gen Z generation now referred to as the tool belt generation. They're starting to look beyond the careerism of colleges for that meaning and purpose.
I do think that expectations are being met with realism when our students come out of college. But I do think that the adage of you got to pay your dues, I think there's some truth to that. However, the dues, as described by someone that is the hiring manager, is sometimes the dues that they paid. And if they come from a previous generation, or maybe even two generations out, their expectation of what that young person should pay for is sometimes unrealistic as well. Because you have a trajectory where most millennials will have had, I think it is 8 to 9 different career jumps within 11 years. And you contrast that to early boomers, you contrast that to traditionalists born 1900 to 1945. And so the expectation is very different. I actually think it's going to, at some point in time, affect Wall Street. And what I mean by that is when you are going after values as being kind of the bedrock of your organization, what we used to judge organizations on Wall Street for being successful, that's going to change with the influence of millennials. And I actually think that's a good thing because quality of life is actually going to be one of the things that will be more important. We in America, we're known for working ourselves to a frazzle. And sometimes that can be problematic when you go to other countries and see some of the exhaling that cultures provide and still getting things done. And so it's one of those things where they're being taught unrealistic expectations. But I also think that there's a balance of that hiring individuals saying, you know what, your dues that you have to pay might be a little bit different.
Mental health issues are a primary concern for Gen Z employees. Many of them want therapists on site. They want health insurance that covers therapeutic services. Do you think these are the outflowing of that anxious generation, or are these just the normal developmental struggles of all emerging adults? And they're finally being addressed by organizations and companies.
I have found, just anecdotally, that the Gen Zers that I have found who are best able to actually thrive in an environment without having the kinds of expectations that say, my workplace ought to immediately reflect all of my values and my workplace ought to give me meaning in life are usually those people who have entered into the workplace in some way. The way that Jonathan Haidt talks about those manageable crises that happen during adolescence, those who have had those positions where they've been able to work, they've been valued in terms of what they can bring, but not in a whole investment of this is your life and this is your career that usually prepares people really well. And I think the lesson on that for us should be, as Christians, what the church ought to look like. I mean, I think for a long time, what we've done is to look at corporate America and employment and say, how do we transfer those things to the church when it actually ought to be the other way around? And when you see the biblical paradigm, you have, for instance, the Paul Timothy sort of relationship where Timothy's gifts and callings are indeed being recognized. I mean, Paul's asking him not to squelch those things. And there is this sense of actual respect in terms of learning and a passing down of learning. Those things often happen within the church when you have an older generation that's not afraid of and in competition with the younger generation, and a younger generation who doesn't assume everything starts all over the minute I get here. We are the ones we've been waiting for. And the church can model that and show us what it's like to live that way.
I would love to see the church be more influential in the marketplace and to create environments where people can belong and not just be welcome, by the way, because belonging is very different. I think everybody being made in the image of God, and you have leaders that are in positions of influence in organizations and corporations all over the world and organizations all over the world. I do think, to Russell's point, it's really important for corporate leaders, organizational leaders, to live out their values. And the thing is, when I see them lived out in an organization, you can feel it. Oftentimes, what's interesting is that the leaders aren't believers, but they have a respect for the human being. And I believe that this is an opportunity for ministry from the people of God that have leadership influence to say, we're going to create an environment that really ministers to the people that it employs.
Let's get really granular here for a moment. Say I'm a manager in a mid-sized company. I know that these Gen Zers are facing the fading of community through family, religion, civic participation, all of those things that used to undergird society. Gen Z doesn't have them in the same way that previous generations did. How would you encourage someone specifically, Scott, to bring some of that community that we used to have into the workplace with a generation that's never known it outside of the office?
First thing I would do is I would have the that leader gather their team and really have them give a definition for the other colleagues to hear. What is meaningful work to you? What is important for you as a part of this team, being a part of this organization? Then the second thing I would do is I would actually put together a small core within the team that would be essentially my ambassadors of culture, of microculture, so to speak. And their job within the team is to listen to what their peers are saying and then to try to, in some way, provide activities, provide opportunities to spend time together inside of work, outside of work, where you can begin to connect and to create community and to create belonging. And what that does also is it serves as a retention strategy to keep the folks that are your ambassadors. It keeps them close because now they are providing more value than their job title, right? So those are kind of some of the first things that I actually ask and coach my folks to do all the time. To create culture within your culture, keep listening and keep that loop of communication open at all times, and then make micro adjustments so that people can feel seen and heard so they can belong, and then let them see that you take not all but some of their ideas and implement them to create a stronger work team.
We're in this crazy historical moment where we have 5 generations in the workforce right now, and one writer called it a demographic traffic jam, where the career ladder is crowded at the top. And Russell, I think about the church. I look at the church and I look at church leadership, and in some ways it feels like a demographic traffic jam there as well. And yet you talk about Paul and Timothy. How do you think we could use this generational gridlock that we see in the workplace and in our churches to our advantage?
One of the problems we have to deal with right now is there are very few actually multi-generational churches at all. And I'm just talking about attenders. You have churches that are marketed around 20 somethings and churches that are marketed around 60 somethings, and rarely are those coming together. And even when they do, they're in churches where the ministries themselves are so isolated from one another that it's very, very hard to put that together. So I think the first step is to recognize that should change, even if we don't know how to change it. To recognize that that's a problem is a really good first step. And then to find those ways where you have an older generation that is actually seeking out ways to impart wisdom and to give opportunity. And that often is not happening because you have this sense of mortality that comes upon people. I mean, I would have students in the seminary where I was dean who would say, I'm going into this church where I'm going to be the assistant pastor And then at some point, the pastor is going to retire and I'm going to become the pastor. And I will say, don't do it. Because in almost every case, you have the senior pastor starting to see that person as a living representation of the fact that I'm going to be irrelevant one day. And you have all of this tension that comes out. But if you have congregations where you have people who are working themselves intentionally toward, we need to look at our 14 and 15-year-olds not as people to whom we're turning everything over, but to people that we recognize one day are going to be in those places, and we're going to give them those ways to get there. And then to be able to say to those younger generations who sometimes fall into Rehoboam's folly of listening only to their own generation, to say, you actually have to come in first with excellence and mission. You can't come in with demands for meaning and make that. I had a wise mentor one day who said, I think there are a lot of people who are waiting for the time when they're invited to exercise their gifts, and then you finally realize nobody's going to invite you. You have to exercise those gifts in little ways, and then those things get recognized and picked up. The church can model that, and I think we should.
Listeners, if you have found yourself bristling in your workplace, check out episode 91 with Mike Cosper's interview with author Frank Bruni about how to handle grievance. Mike's out in the field today collecting more interviews just like it, and we can't wait for you to hear them in the coming weeks. We will be right back. This past weekend, Israeli soldiers recovered the bodies of 6 newly executed hostages in the tunnels under Rafah near the Gaza Egypt border. This news prompted massive protests and a work strike to erupt in Israel, demanding an immediate ceasefire to secure the remaining hostages held by Hamas. In the wake of this outpouring of grief, Hamas indicated in an announcement that the military is working under new orders to execute hostages should Israeli forces approach their locations in Gaza. And the terrorist organization has been drip releasing video footage of the hostages, giving what Hamas has called their last messages. Joining us to reflect on these deaths is friend of the Bulletin and policy editor at the Bulwark, Mona Charen. Mona, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Clarissa. Good to be here.
Just saying those words makes me feel like I need to take a pause and a deep breath. It feels very heavy. We know that the families of these hostages are calling the actions from Hamas psychological terror. And I wonder if here at the beginning you could talk to me about the response of the American Jewish community to this news.
As painful as it is, we do have to dwell on the sadism inherent in the actions of Hamas here. It isn't just the murder, it is the fact that these hostage videos were then released post-murder to inflict even more suffering on the families and on all of the nation of Israel and Jews around the world, frankly, or even not just Jews, but all decent human beings. So the sadism is a piece of this that it's important to keep in mind. Again, there are so many comparisons of body counts, and we can get into this later, but Israel is accused falsely, I think, of genocide. But in point of fact, the level of intentional cruelty on the part of Hamas is just off the charts. And Israelis, yes, are responsible for killing lots of Palestinians, though they did not choose to, they do not want to. They make efforts to limit civilian casualties and so on. But you've never seen an Israeli official or an organ of any of the Israeli government do something like release a hostage video just to put salt in the wound. As far as the American Jewish community's reaction, it's, first of all, terrible grief, all of that very understandable. But then the American Jewish community, like others, and certainly like Israelis and well meaning people around the world, is complicated by the fact that they are really not sure what the correct road forward is here. Is it accepting some of Hamas's terms for a ceasefire so that you can get out the remaining live hostages? Or is it a hard line and saying, no, we cannot reward this kind of thing from Hamas. We cannot be seen to be being willing to pay a price for hostage taking and murder. And people who are saying it's simple, people who are saying it's very clear, Netanyahu's obviously wrong here, or he's obviously right. I actually think this is one of the most difficult moral and psychological dilemmas that any people has ever faced. The other aspect of this that's so painful is that a large majority of the Israeli population believes that Netanyahu is not trustworthy. And he has richly earned that reputation, I have to say, because he's hung on too long to power. But he has made some really terrible decisions, and he does seem to be self-interested. And yet, it's possible that in this particular instance, he's not wrong.
Mona, when you think of the people in the streets in Israel right now, that massive anti Netanyahu demonstration, what do most people want? If Netanyahu were to step aside right now, would it be a hostage deal with a ceasefire? Would it just be the expression that he should have protected the country and October 7th never should happen? Or do people know?
I think there is widespread support for a ceasefire slash hostage deal, and they're willing to accept the risks of at least Hamas being able to claim some sort of military victory. All that Hamas has to do to claim military victory, having destroyed the Palestinian enclave, the Hamas enclave by their decision to make war, all they need to claim victory is to say, we're still here. Thousands of Palestinians are dead. So many have lost their homes. The country is devastated. But all they need to do to say, we won, is they weren't able to kill us, and Hamas is still in charge.
Is this a reality that the rest of the world sees? Or when they call for a ceasefire, are they looking for something different?
The rest of the world does not see it this way. On the heels of this grotesque execution of these 6 hostages, you saw Britain suspending arms for Israel, at least temporarily, or some arms. You've seen many people saying that this is somehow Israel's fault instead of placing the blame on Hamas. And if you don't mind a more global observation, there is a myth that the dispute is a territorial one and that the solution is a two-state solution. And it is so misguided because Hamas does not want a two-state solution. It wants the annihilation of Israel at all costs.
One of the reasons that these hostage deaths have hit us so hard here in the US is that we just met one of those families 2 weeks ago at the Democratic National Convention when the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Poland spoke there. And when it comes to foreign policy, conservative Republicans have always been strongly pro Israel, but we started to see some of that language emerging at the DNC from Kamala Harris and her husband, Doug Emhoff. Talk to me a little bit about the shifting that's happening here. It seems when it comes to conservatism, is there a shifting in the parties when it comes to how we're talking about Israel?
There is a very dramatic flip that has happened on foreign policy in general between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republican Party that I grew up in was the Liberty Party, it was the Promote Democracy Party, it was the anti-totalitarian, anti-authoritarian party. And the Democrats were more squishy, and they were thinking that, well, these left-wing regimes, they have the right idea if sometimes their methods are a little harsh. They were uncomfortable with a robust American foreign policy. They tended to think that the US role in the world was negative instead of positive. That has flipped completely. Basically, the wind is at the backs of people in the Republican Party who are not so much isolationists, although they've been called that. No, they are friends of dictators, friends of authoritarians around the world, and against American leadership. They're against NATO, etc. On Israel, there's a footnote because Republicans are still broadly very supportive of Israel, more than Democrats. Democrats are mixed on Israel. There is a faction in the Democratic Party that buys into the left-wing narrative about oppressors and oppressed, and that Palestinians are the oppressed people, and therefore that's who the Democratic Party should be sympathizing with, much like the campus protesters believe that the world is divided between oppressors and oppressed. And so there's that element in the Democratic Party. Joe Biden kept the Democrats very firmly in the pro-Israel camp. Kamala Harris is saying those things, but with a little less of the music that you got from Biden. Sometimes she'll say things, well, I, for one, will not be silent, for example, when she was talking about a meeting with Netanyahu. So a little bit of a different tone from her. And so I think we don't yet know where she would take foreign policy when it comes to Israel, whether she would tilt more toward the very strongly Biden approach, or whether she is more aligned with the left wing of the party on Israel.
You think about the time when suddenly in the scientific community, the Big Bang theory was universally accepted and shown to be true. We almost have the same thing in social and political life with the horseshoe theory, that it is almost impossible to see how anybody could deny it when you have the kind of campus protesting on the left that you were talking about. And then today, we have the big controversy that is happening in the United States. Tucker Carlson, musing with a historian of sorts about whether Churchill or Adolf Hitler were the bad guys in World War II. And at a Turning Point USA event, Charlie Kirk saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers," means that we should be opposed to all of the warmongers who want to be engaged in Ukraine and elsewhere around the world, to J.D. Vance. It sounded like a George McGovern rally.
We have seen in time after time that countries that seem super civilized, and I began by studying the Nazis and the rise of Nazism in Europe. Germany was the most educated, the most culturally advanced, the most scientifically forward country in Europe. And it descended in very rapid order into a genocidal lunatic regime. And so we have to bear in mind that it is easy for people to get there, and that we constantly have to be on guard against it, because in contrast to people who shrug their shoulders and say, oh, come on, our institutions are strong. That could never happen here. I think the opposite. I think you constantly have to bolster strong institutions, strong values, resistance to that kind of siren call of authoritarianism, because it's so easy for people to succumb to it.
Mona, in this conversation, I keep thinking we're standing in a pile of rubble. What do we pick up and hold on to? How do we develop the fortitude and courage to become principled people? What do we need to hold on to and conserve?
One of the things that I think we desperately need in a really tawdry time is that we need to look to our history for sources of inspiration, for people who did the right thing even when it was difficult, or people who set an excellent moral example, because we need to remind people that it is possible to achieve moral excellence. So when you ask, what are conservatives conserving? My fundamental answer is we're conserving the American founding. We are a nation that was founded by Enlightenment thinkers, and Enlightenment values, including individual rights, human dignity, limits on arbitrary power. Those are all woven into our founding. And in order to be a true conservative, that's the thing you have to be concerned about preserving.
Mona, thank you so much for these important reflections. Listeners, be sure to hit subscribe in your podcast app so that you always get the latest from us here at the Bulletin. We will be right back. This past week, NASA announced that astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams will return to Earth in February, 8 months later than originally scheduled. The two were meant to be in space for 8 days on a new Boeing spacecraft, but due to helium leaks and thruster failures, they've been on the ISS, the International Space Station, for 3 months and still have about 5 to go until they'll hitch a ride back with the SpaceX Dragon capsule, whose flight was already scheduled. Joining us to talk about exploring strange new worlds and boldly going where no man has gone before is Jeff Williams. Jeff is a retired NASA astronaut and at one time held the American record for longest time in space. He was a two-time station commander at the ISS. Jeff, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thank you, Clarissa. Good to be with you.
Could you take us back for a minute to the beginning of June when all of this began? Boeing had waited 7 years to launch this spacecraft with NASA astronauts on a journey to the ISS. What was the mission of this trip, and what did NASA and Boeing hope for?
Well, in the bigger context, we've had a continuous series actually for the last several decades of new starts, if you will, building the space station and the different phases of that, going through the phases of the Columbia accident actually, and then returning to flight with the space shuttle. And we're working in international context, so we're working with the Russians along with the other partners from Europe, Japan, and Canada. In recent years, we initiated contracts with SpaceX and Boeing to develop new spacecraft to ferry crews to and from the International Space Station. Finally got to the point where the team decided that it was ready to launch with a test crew, and they launched last June. Had some issues, as you identified, during the rendezvous and docking to the space station. And here we are. They've worked through that, and they've decided they're not going to return the crew on that Starliner from the space station.
The media kind of paints this as dire and unexpected, but is this within the range of normal for an astronaut? Do you go to space planning for this sort of thing?
Well, I wouldn't call it normal, but we do go to space recognizing that there's all kinds of risks involved and that the team's job is to manage the risk, identify them, manage them, minimize the risk. But we launch knowing that things can go wrong, and things do go wrong occasionally. And so this is the latest example of it. When things come up, we just, as a team, work through it.
You mentioned the Columbia disaster in 2003, and I grew up in New Hampshire, and we watched the Challenger take off in 1986. The loss of Krista McAuliffe was palpable in my community growing up, and NASA said in the press conference last week that the decision to stay in space was based on this desire for safety. What does safety look like now that we depend on private enterprise to bring us to and from space? And how did we come to this place where an airplane manufacturer and Elon Musk are the ones who are sending Americans into space?
The policy of the U.S. government several years ago included transition to what we call privatization of space activities. And really, it's just a different way to procure the capability. Before that, both in DoD, the Department of Defense, and NASA, we would issue a contract to a company after they bid on the possibility. They'd get selected, and they would develop a spacecraft, for example, or an aircraft, and deliver it to the government, and then the government would own it and operate it. This is a little different approach under the umbrella of what's called commercialization, where we issued a contract to SpaceX and Boeing to develop a spacecraft to deliver crews to the space station, return them to Earth. But they didn't deliver the vehicle to us. They own it. They own the operation. They're providing the service. So that's the best way to describe it. So now we contract with them to provide the service. However, we're still very involved with them technically in the development of the vehicle, in managing the operation of the vehicle. It's just that in this case, Boeing is responsible for it.
You played a key role in the design and the construction, the operation of the ISS. And when you retired, you had spent, I read, a whopping 534 days in space. It's just amazing. Can you talk to me about the headspace of Butch and Sonny now? What does it look like to be able to get into the headspace of, I'm going to be here for a long time. This is what my life is going to look like with this limited a number of people and in this limited kind of space?
We all launch recognizing the risks involved and recognizing that there's contingencies that might come, and those contingencies might delay us on orbit. So I know them both very well. My guess is they're actually enjoying the bonus time in space, recognizing that there's some technical issues and questions with their vehicle, which is currently their lifeboat if there was a problem on space station. So there's still an elevated awareness of risk involved with that. But I know they both love being in space. And so certainly there's adjustments that have to be made for families and folks on the ground. And that was always my biggest concern up there, was making sure the family was taken care of. And you miss events. I missed our older son's graduation from high school because I was on orbit on my first flight. So big events, both positive and negative on the ground. But they launched prepared for it. And like I said, I think in the end, they're enjoying their big bonus time, if you will, extending on orbit.
You mentioned missing some of the difficult things. And certainly, if you are hundreds of thousands of miles above the Earth, you are missing some of the geopolitical strain that the US and Russia have been engaging right now. Is it really this place of serenity where two countries who are in conflict on the ground can be at peace in the sky?
We don't really miss that because we're getting news every day, and we're having to operate now for the last several years under the conditions of the geopolitical problems and the war in Ukraine and whatnot. But I can tell you that the partnership between NASA and Russian Space Agency, which is called Roscosmos, is very good. And both sides are working very hard to continue to safely and effectively execute the program. The crew coherence is still very, very good and very healthy. So we're not letting the political and the diplomatic issues get in the way of the operation.
2 years ago, Russia had said that they didn't plan to remain at the ISS after 2024. Do you expect them to follow through with that? And are America's days numbered when it comes to research that's conducted there?
The program could end any time, with unexpected events, whether they be geopolitical or technical events. However, I think it will continue. If you look at it historically, there's always been that kind of rhetoric that's gone on as we have each time extended the life of the space station. When we launched the first element in 1998, the design lifetime extended to 2015. And it quickly got extended beyond 2015 to 2022, and then 2024, and then 2028, and then 2030. And NASA is actually working to extend it out to 2034 from a technical qualification perspective. And every step along the way, historically, NASA has led the way. NASA and the U.S. government has said, yes, we're going to extend out to this. And then the other partners have followed suit, the European Space Agency, Japan, and Canada. And then historically, the Russians have followed suit as well. They just are the last ones from a government perspective to say, yeah, we're going to extend it. So I expect that they will go ahead and extend along with us.
It's hard to believe that it's been over 60 years now since President Kennedy promised that we'd get a man on the moon. It seems such a small feat in comparison to some of the amazing and extraordinary things that are happening in space now. Do you think that there's something distinctively American about our longing to get to space?
Certainly, yeah. If you look at the history of America, America was discovered, because of exploration and discovery, the North America, the continent. And then we know the history of the colonization, and then later the revolution and the birth of America, and then leading in technology and whatnot. A Christian perspective, obviously, would see it even a broader way. Knowing from the scriptures that we're created in the image of God, and He is the creator, we have a creative element bearing that image. And we have this curiosity in us and this inherent drive to explore, to kind of wonder, well, what can we do with this? And then we discover, and then we experiment, and then we put things together, and then find a use for what we have discovered or developed through science and technology. I think it's inherent in humanity to want to do this. And human spaceflight is just one of the current chapters of that exploration. And I'm glad you're interested in the International Space Station in the bigger context, because my feeling is, although maybe I'm biased because it's been my life, I think it's the greatest, most amazing technological achievement in human history, given the duration, the complexity of it. It's bigger than a football field. Its first element launched in 1998, and it's done in the context of this international partnership. So the geopolitical stage that it is unfolding in is equally amazing when you think about all of the details. And it's a story largely untold.
You've written so much about your faith and spoken about your faith. In fact, listeners, I want you to check out Jeff's Instagram account. It is at @astro_JeffW. We'll put it in the show notes for you. It is like a picture book rendering of Psalm 19's "The heavens declare the glory of God." I couldn't believe that the photos of Earth from space that you took over your years in space are just mind-blowingly beautiful. And as I looked through those pictures, I couldn't help thinking, how could anyone see all of this and think all of it happened by chance? And I wonder, could you talk to me about the experience of being in space as a person of faith? Can you go there and still walk away and say, there is no God? Is there something there in that experience that indelibly changes a person at the soul level?
I don't think anybody would deny that it has a big impact on you, anybody that's been there. Now, what the impact is varies, of course, from person to person, but there is an awe and wonder that I think is common with everybody, just imagining that, getting off the planet and viewing the planet from space. And I would say that sometimes I get a variation of the question of, did it change my view of God or my relationship with God? And the short answer is, and there's a little bit of a shock effect to this, is no. But then I have to explain it. Certainly when we see his creative work, many of your listeners have gone to the Grand Canyon and stood on the South Rim and viewed the grandeur of that view. And that gives a glimpse of maybe the experience of getting off the planet and viewing Earth. So everybody experiences the awe and wonder, but all it does is tell us, whether you admit it or not, that there is a God. Now, having said that, being awakened to the truth of the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who reveals the Father and who is not only the Redeemer, the Creator, now going and have the experience just puts tremendous depth and relief in the truth that is in Scripture. You talked about Psalm 19. There's passages in Job and other Psalms, and throughout the Scripture, his work as creator is affirmed over and over and over again. So it deepens the significance of those words.
So much of space is about what is vast, what is larger than us. What did you notice in your time in space that was small, but surprisingly significant to you?
Well, what comes to mind when you ask that question is a lot of folks have been reported to say when they go to space how insignificant they feel because of the vastness of space. I think also because of my awareness of the Scripture and bearing the image of the Creator and redeemed by the work of Christ, I see a great significance in that. I don't feel small, even though I am small and insignificant in and of myself. But to have that vantage point, looking through the lens of Scripture and understanding his purposeful creation and creation of each and every soul that exists who bear his image, that brings a depth of significance. And actually a sense of responsibility grows out of that, a sense of gratitude grows. But we don't live for ourselves. We live for him. I have a very deep perspective of life as a calling. And we're all called to different positions of life or offices of life, as Luther used to call it. And, it can be an office of husband or wife or parent or accountant or doctor or engineer or astronaut. So I've considered that throughout my career. I'm called to this place and I need to steward the calling. It's bigger than us. So although you can feel small personally from a point of view, there's a uniqueness and a significance and a purpose that's greater than yourself that I experienced in all my time at space.
Jeff, thank you so much for answering that call and for joining us today. Friends, we'll see you next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester. Theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.